You just started to describe, like, what is the reality here? Am I responsible for taking care of this fellow? How responsible am I?
Right.
That's what a good wife does, isn't it? Doesn't a good wife just take care of her husband?
Well, that's the point, right? Because we start bringing in societal, cultural, whatever the rules are, we start naming them. Is this a societal thing? Is this a familial thing, a cultural thing? Or is my partner potentially a narcissist, right? Because there's a gamut, and what we have to do is widen the lens. But I love what you're saying about going down the path of that fantasy world, because it really is important. If we don't go there, then it's hard for that person to recognize that they might actually validate the abuse.
Yes.
Because they actually, what's running the show is that fantasy where they are this terrible person. They really are this disappointment if they don't show up and bring the coffee every single morning at 7 a.m. on the dot.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. Today, we're diving into the second part of my conversation with Kamini Wood. In the earlier part of our discussion, we explored how narcissism can develop as a protective response to painful affects such as shame, emotional inconsistency, a lack of affect attunement, and unmet attachment needs that all happen very early in life. In this part of our conversation, we begin tracing how those same early survival strategies start reappearing in adult relationships. Why can a simple disagreement, a partner's feedback or different opinion, or even a new boss with different expectations feel so psychologically threatening to someone with strong narcissistic defenses? Why do some people suddenly shift into withdrawal or devaluation or control, or they blame you when they feel either criticized or dependent or like you're not there for them? We also explore what keeps someone emotionally tied to a partner exhibiting narcissistic traits, including the gradual ways people can lose their voice, shrink themselves, and become disconnected from their own needs and perceptions over time. Finally, we compare and contrast our different theoretical and, more importantly, clinical approaches to helping someone begin separating from these painful relational patterns, reclaim their own sense of self, and develop a stronger identity apart, yes, different from, a partner who is exhibiting narcissistic traits. There's a lot packed into this part of the conversation, and I'm really excited to share it with you. So let's get right into the second part of my conversation with Kamini Wood.
Here's the thing. So I say that, as children, we become adapted, right? We're adaptive. And so this is where it starts. Well, what happens is it becomes a survival pattern. So now we take this in intimate relationship. I want to say even a workplace relationship, because we're very engaged, right? Because this can absolutely show up in workplaces. But let's just focus on intimate relationships for the time being. Well, it was a survival strategy. That's what was created. And so now this plays out in this relationship where any type of criticism feels completely intolerable. It feels like, oh my gosh, I'm being attacked. So we go into this fight or flight. Right? Or any type of vulnerability feels unsafe. So we pull back. That person doesn't show up with any sense of vulnerability and instead might actually lash out with shaming their partner. It's your fault. You have a personality disorder and you're crazy. You're the one who's hypersensitive and has an anger issue. Accountability, any type of accountability feels threatening. So when you're in a relationship, if both people have a part in any of the dynamics, right? But if you're in a relationship with somebody with these really strong narcissistic tendencies, they're not going to be able to take any accountability. It's always going to be your fault.
Yes.
And if you're in that year over year, even if at the beginning you're like, no, it's not. You're human. And eventually you're hearing this, you're internalizing it, and it starts to diminish your own sense of self. And I've seen this time and time again with my clients. When they come to coach with me, they have no concept of who they are. Their self-trust is gone. Their ability to know what they need. They cannot name their needs. Their own self-confidence and self-esteem is completely diminished because their identity has been completely lost in those dynamics. So if you hear over and over again, everything is your fault, or over and over again, how you're the one who is causing the problem, or you're the oversensitive, or anytime you bring up anything that is any type of disagreement, you mentioned this earlier, disagreement of thoughts, it becomes you have an anger issue. I mean, all of those things in that dynamic, it whittles away and that person gets smaller and smaller and smaller until really they don't even have a sense of self. Where I've seen this in romantic relationships is now this becomes an internal conflict because they have a value of family, they have a value of marriage, and then there was a value of self at some point, and now they're in conflict because it's like, well, I need to stay in this to make this thing work because, hey, we have kids together and I have this value of marriage and family. And yet in the whole process, they are becoming less and less of their own being.
Yes. Yeah. And then one other thing that I would add to that nice description that you gave is sometimes they have a hard time even recognizing that it wasn't their fault, right? So,
Gosh, yes.
because sometimes, not always, these people get in relationships with these narcissistically disturbed, let's say, individuals, whether they have NPD or traits. We'll hold off on that for now. But that assumes that there's a certain level of what? Grandiosity, dominance, control, arrogance, right? So they initially may even find it hard to recognize that, oh, is it possible that, let's prototypical example, your husband was upset that you didn't bring him the coffee on time and that's why he was yelling at you? Like, in other words, is it possible that this had anything to do with what was going on inside of your husband at that moment, rather than you failed to do, and you could fill in the blank here, whatever it is they're being accused of, on that given day?
Right. And to that example, what happens in the beginning, because it's so subtle, that's actually a great example because it's actually quite subtle, because taken on its own, one could say, oh my gosh, I don't know where my mind is at. I forgot to bring in the coffee. It becomes that person's fault. But then what we're talking about is it happens again and again over everything, right? And those things compound. I say this even in change, right? Make small changes because they'll compound to make the larger change. This happens in these dynamics as things are subtle, but when you add them all up over time, you're like, oh my gosh, there's the pattern. And I've had clients who have said to me, after they've finally decided like, okay, this isn't healthy, I do need to make a change. So they maybe have left the dynamic because nothing's changing. They're emotionally and physically struggling, right? And their own friends and family will question is like, well, didn't you see it? Like, didn't you know, like when you first got together? The truth is they really didn't, because it was subtle. And only over time do you start to be able to see it whittle away, right? Yeah. Or conversely, family and friends will say things like, well, did he ever hit you or something like that? It's always physical. Nobody's really paying attention to what happens emotionally in these dynamics, which is just, it's an important.
Yeah, this is a whole nother can of worms. I don't want to go too far down this, but oftentimes they don't notice it also. To your point, yes, it's so subtle. But sometimes what I find in these dynamics, because I work with both sides of the fence, right? I work with people clearly who have been accused of being narcissistically disturbed, and I work with the partners as well. And sometimes what we find with the partners is they don't see this because it's so important to them for their own reasons, their own history, to outsource everything to the husband. So they look to the husband in this prototypical example as a guiding light, to sort of function for them, to think for them, to tell them what's right or wrong. This is like, getting into a cult, by the way, which we talked about. I've mentioned, I've had conversations about the cult-like mentality that these people get brought into, but there's something very reassuring. I know that sounds paradoxical, but being in the cult, at least you know what's right and wrong, and you don't have to think for yourself. You have somebody who kind of takes over all of these functions for you. So there may be a little bit of, this isn't the right word, but like resistance to see it, because then you're going to upset the apple cart, right? When this is not working for you, but in some strange way, it does work for you.
No, that's a great point. And I think it's related to codependency, right? Because I think what ends up happening in a lot of these dynamics is you'll see, at least in my line of work, you'll see overfunctioners end up pairing up with somebody with narcissistic personality traits. And they're in a codependency is created with that because the need to be needed is so high in that individual who is proving their worth, right? And so they end up in those dynamics. And so the idea of seeing this subconsciously, right? It's too scary to see it, because this identity around proving worth, proving enoughness, overfunctioning, overdo, all those things, there's that codependency that also has to be addressed.
Well, what's the overfunctioning? Like, what is that? Can you maybe just define that for the listeners? It's not a term I typically use, but I've been thinking about a little bit more lately because I've been hearing it, but maybe you could define that for us.
Yes, I talk about this all the time because I find that overfunctioning, I call it another pressure pattern or survival pattern. It's actually a form of fawning if we think about it. It's I'm going to take care of everything because I'm trying to, not to use your words, not upset the apple cart. I don't want to create conflict. I don't want to make waves here. So I'm going to do everything. I'm going to anticipate everybody's needs. And I'm going to, carpool needs to be done. And, I also need to bake these things for the school. And I'm also going to be working. And, my spouse needs X, Y, and Z done. And I'm going to pay. It's like, I'm going to do everything.
Okay.
And it's a way to keep safe, because if I make sure everything is done, then there's no fear of conflict.
Okay, so I imagine also, I'm just imagining, but you tell me, because I can see you've become affectively alive now, so this is your jam, I can tell, right? Well, with the overfunctioning, do they also then, like if they're getting blamed for something or criticized, do they then step away from that and say, okay, I need to be so introspective and think, how did I actually create this problem? Why did I do it this way? Why couldn't I just prepare his coffee? Why did I sleep in the morning? Is that part of overfunction? Like you mentioned literal things that they do, but I'm imagining what goes on intrapsychically as well.
Yes. I will say after they work with me, they might be able to do that. Most overfunctioners, what they end up doing is they immediately go into self-blame, self-shame, and inner critic takes over. And they do more. Your pattern, survival pattern is overfunctioning and you get criticized for something, you're going to double down on that overfunctioning until you're able to become aware of the pattern and name it, and then take actions to do the introspection. And then how am I going to show up differently? What's the small action I'm going to take differently?
Yeah, because an action, I would imagine, is so reassuring. Like it's so much more comforting to take an action on something as compared to slowing down and really engaging that more reflective thinking process, which is not easy.
Oh my gosh, the reflecting thinking process is not easy. And also what ends up happening with a lot of overfunctioners, they tend to also be overthinkers. And they're going to cycle and cycle and cycle, right? And so here's the thing. It's to become aware of the overfunctioning pattern. And then it is to say, okay, what's one thing I'm going to do differently? Just one thing. And you start small, because if you're an overfunctioner, you're overfunctioning in grand ways. And so it's to find one small thing to begin with that you're going to step back on the overfunctioning.
We're being overly schematic if we're saying thinking that they overthink. But they're probably not really overthinking. They're like obsessing, right? Like in other words, it's not productive. They're not getting themselves out of a...
Rumination's a better word.
Yeah, like they're ruminating. Okay, yeah, I call it chuntering. Like when you start getting in your head, it's like this chuntering goes on and it's not usually very positive or productive.
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, let's keep going with this. I like this line of thought because again, it leads into something I wanted to talk to you about anyway, which is the healing process and what leads to change. Let me kick it off and then I want to hear your perspective. But like if I'm working with somebody like this, see, I'm switching gears here. I was thinking coming into this more talking about the person who has the narcissistic characteristics, in which we did, and we talked about where that came from. But now we're thinking about the person who's with this kind of partner, right? So if they don't bring the coffee, just to use this sort of prototypical example, what I would slowly do is try to increase what we call mentalization, their capacity to think about the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors of the spouse. So what I would encourage them to do by way of asking inquisitive questions is, why is it you imagine that he got so upset with you this morning? Well, I slept in, I didn't have his coffee prepared. Oh, yes, I understand that part. But what about that was so upsetting? What do you picture? Like to have that kind of reaction? Right? And slowly what we begin to get into is her. It doesn't matter whether she's right or wrong in terms of what's going on in this guy's mind, but that she starts to at least develop a theory and have some capacity to get space now so she could think about what belongs to her and what belongs to him. And slowly what we see as we do enough of this is oftentimes these things happen at moments of separation. Right? Because that goes back, we spoke about this a little earlier. Even to have a separate thought is painfully difficult for somebody who has these narcissistic traits. So this is a separation. In other words, she's not there for him in the morning and he can't tolerate that. So it's not just, you can argue, yes, it is about the coffee, but it's not just about the coffee. Now an interpersonal dynamic has been disrupted because he's expecting her to always be there to take care, like a good narcissist, right? Like they have these expectations, right? Like someone should be there and validate and take care of me and give me my narcissistic supplies.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm just curious, how you see that or how you work with it, maybe what's similar or different from that approach.
Let's take a quick break.
Are you tired of feeling like you're walking on eggshells all the time? Do you feel drained, confused, or like nothing you do is ever good enough? Are you stuck in a cycle of elation, then criticism and confusion? If any of this sounds familiar, you're not alone. And that's exactly why I created Office Hours with Dr. Anthony Mazzella. That's me. Office Hours is a low-cost, small group space where you could bring your questions about narcissistic traits and dynamics and the places where you feel stuck. You'll be met with honest, grounded feedback. I'll hold the group with structure, but there's also space for real conversation. This is a space designed for anyone looking for clarity, insight, and support. If that sounds like you, just click the link in the show notes to join us. Okay, I hope to see you there.
I work very similar to your approach. I think what the one caveat I would say is I add in, that part of like what's going on in you, right? And how did you internalize it? What meaning did you make of it? Because through so I'm specialized in narcissistic recovery, like abuse recovery. So I really work with the people who are coming out of these dynamics more than I recognize that you work with both sides. So I focus a lot. Yes, let's talk about what you think happened with him or her, whoever the other person is. But I also spend a lot of time of what was going on within you and then pushing the envelope of what's actually true about the morning with the coffee, as an example. So what's actually true is you overslept. What's actually true is you did not bring him his coffee. And what's actually true is that's not your responsibility. Like, unless it's been signed, like I have to bring you your coffee every single day and the world stops circling, spinning because you don't have your, it's to bring it into reality. Like what's actually true here? Because what we're doing is we're opening the capacity and that lens, the ability for this person to see things outside of the way that they've been seeing it, because they've only been seeing it in one tunnel vision.
Wait, let me jump in. Wait. Yeah, let me jump in right there. I love this because this is great for the audience, for people who are listening, because this is a good example of the psychodynamic approach and your approach. So the psychodynamic approach, when you said, I'm helping them focus like on the reality, like, is that your responsibility? Right at that moment in my mind, as I was listening to you, I was imagining I was going to get deeper into her fantasy world. Like, what did it mean to you that you overslept? How did you feel about yourself? What did it mean that you weren't there for him? Because now this is all part of a fantasy that what? She wasn't good enough. She wasn't adequate. She let him down. So then if he does really become abusive, in her mind, she could be very much rational. Like, I deserve that. Yeah, like, of course he would be abusive because look what a disappointment I am. So anyway, I'm sorry, I jumped in, but I just wanted to juxtapose that with going deeper into a fantasy of what she's picturing because she slept in and how she felt about that. Because from this perspective, that becomes important because then it leads to her not being able to do what? Stand up for herself, I guess. Or you just started to describe, like, what is the reality here? Am I responsible for taking care of this fellow? How responsible am I?
Right.
But that's what a good wife does, isn't it? Doesn't a good wife just take care of her husband? Right?
Well, that's the point, right? Because we start bringing in societal, cultural, whatever the rules are, we start naming them. Is this a societal thing? Is this a familial thing, a cultural thing? Or is my partner potentially a narcissist, right? Because there's a gamut, and what we have to do is widen the lens. But I love what you're saying about going down the path of that fantasy world, because it really is important. If we don't go there, then it's hard for that person to recognize that they might actually validate the abuse.
Yes.
Because they actually, what's running the show is that fantasy where they are this terrible person. They really are this disappointment if they don't show up and bring the coffee every single morning at 7 a.m. on the dot.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if this is something that gets discussed enough. I certainly don't do much of it on my podcast, but there's a sadomasochistic quality in a lot of these relationships as well. So if in fact she starts to beat herself up and then deserves that punishment, she's then in that submissive position, right? Being beaten, not literally, but sometimes actually literally, but emotionally. And then it begins to have more of a sadomasochistic quality to it, which then has to be explored as well, is how come you feel, or you're so convinced you're deserving of this? And what would it feel like to talk to him about not getting the coffee or having a different morning routine? I understand that getting the coffee works for you, but it may not work for me. What would that even be like? What do you imagine speaking up like that would evoke for you?
Right. Which is a great question, because oftentimes what I receive from my clients is almost panic and fear. If they're in these real dynamics where this has been the case. It is so scary to potentially even contemplate saying something. And that's a telltale sign.
Oh,
now we're dealing with, we're not dealing with a trait that we were talking about, like this end of the spectrum. We're dealing with the other end of the spectrum.
That's what I was just going to say. That's right. Because now they're not This goes back to where we started, right? Where things are more rigid, ossified, and stuck. Because if you can't even imagine, nevertheless, take a step to try something different, now that's a rigid way of living in a relationship.
It's a rigid way, and it's also an indication that the survivor partner is walking on eggshells, right? They're measuring everything that they say. So they're very careful with what they do say and what they don't say.
Yeah, but they have to walk on eggshells for what reason? Why do they walk on eggshells?
They walk on eggshells because there is a belief that this is how I survive, right? This is the way to survive within this dynamic.
That's right. But I think we're saying the same thing. But let's flesh it out a bit more, because they're walking on eggshells because this is the way to survive. If they speak up, what's going to happen? This is beautiful because we're reviewing. So I don't even have to write a conclusion for this now. We're reviewing. Developmentally, you told us this earlier. If they speak up, what's going to happen?
Well, that's when all the attachment issues come up, right? If they speak up,
Yeah.
now we're facing abandonment, we're facing conflict, we're facing all of the things that we've been afraid of,
Yes.
which is an important point that we didn't make earlier. Yes, the person with narcissistic traits, they have a vulnerability cycle, but so does the person that's in the dynamic.
Yes. Yes. Tell us, please say a little more, because that's what I'm getting at, because they become stuck as well in a certain way of thinking about things.
Because that's the key is both individuals in any relationship are coming in with their own vulnerabilities, right? And so the person who is on the receiving end of the narcissistic treatment, whatever, however we want to phrase it, they have a vulnerability cycle too. And so they're in it and they're afraid to speak up. Why are they afraid to speak up? Because they've got their own insecure attachment potentially from their childhood. Conflict means abandonment. Conflict means I'm going to be demeaned. Conflict means there's some type of repercussion. There's some type of punishment. So we don't want that. Right. And so they choose not to speak up. They're going to continue to measure what they say. And so we've got both people dealing with their own attachment qualities and ways that whatever has taken, neither one really has a secure attachment in this dynamic, right? Because if somebody starts to develop a secure attachment, they're able to then say, okay, I'm going to speak up and whatever happens, I'm going to meet it. But in these dynamics, what I've seen time and time again, I mentioned this a few minutes ago, that person starts to lose their sense of self. So their ability to see their own capacity gets diminished. And so once that eggshell walking starts, it just keeps escalating. And before you know it, that person's not walking eggshells with just that partner. They're walking eggshells in different areas of their life. With other people who aren't even necessarily narcissistic. Have become so accustomed to measuring what they say that they do it in all domains of life.
That's a really nice definition. You know, I speak about, I run a study group on the work of John Steiner. He's a British psychoanalyst, but he has this concept called psychic retreats. I talk about it a lot on the podcast, and listeners write in about this. And this is a really nice illustration of it, because what happens is when you feel like you're walking on eggshells, to use your phrase, right? Or the phrase, you start to live a very different life. You said it doesn't just happen in this relationship, but that you're kind of afraid to exist in life in multiple areas. It becomes quite pervasive. And this is what we talk about in terms of a psychic retreat is you're moving through life, but you're not really in life. You know, it's kind of like a snail who goes into the shell, like when there's some danger, like you live your life as if you're in your shell and you're so afraid to come out. Because again, walking on eggshells, you're going to be judged, criticized, abandoned in the worst case scenario, you know, depending on the level you said of range. You know, there's a range of the fear of what you think is going all the way to what we call annihilation anxiety. But it's terrifying. So it's safer inside the retreat, you know?
Yes, I love that correlation.
Yeah. All right. Listen, I think we covered a lot of ground. Is there anything that I missed or anything else that you would like to add before we wrap it up?
I think we covered a lot of ground, you know, and I love the fact that you work with both sides of a coin or both types of people. I do think from my perspective, the one thing that I want to offer is I don't say that coming out of a dynamic like this is super easy. I always say that it's one that people should lead with a lot of self-compassion. So if you're in that dynamic, really start with self-compassion, kindness to self over judgment, because it's so easy to get stuck in that idea of what's wrong with me or I mess this up.
Well, then you're back. You see, right there, you're back in the retreat. You see, you're not out because now you're back in that mindset. That's what will keep you safe, right? Because how did I mess this up? What's wrong with me? You're no longer invested in the relationship. You're like, what's that? Ruminating again. You see, you're into your own mind now, not into the mind of another. That's why I mentioned that as a way of an example of one of the ways I would work with this prototypical woman is to mentalize, is to think about the other person, because at least you're getting out of your own mind, which is risky. But to your point, I'm sorry, I jumped in, but I like when you described
you're
these
totally
things.
fine. I just wanted to offer that one little nugget of self-compassion. I'm a true believer in kindness over judgment. It's so easy for all of us to, be compassionate to other people. I shouldn't say it's so easy, but for a lot of us, it's a lot easier to be compassionate to somebody else. It's about bringing that home. Being compassionate to self.
Well, very nicely said. Thank you again for taking the time to be here today and for sharing your perspective with my listeners. So we really appreciate you.
I appreciate you.
Okay, bye. There's still so much more to say about this, but we have to stop here for now. If this spoke to you and you're curious to learn more about all issues related to narcissism, please support the show by subscribing so you don't miss what's coming next. And even more importantly, take a moment to leave a review. Reviews make the podcast easier for others to find, which helps the show grow. The more the show grows, the more I can invest in creating thoughtful content that supports you in understanding and navigating your experiences with narcissism. Okay, Thanks for being here with me. I'm grateful we got to explore this one together. Until next time, take care of yourself. Bye for now.